Today we're going to be talking about Mustang maintenance, specifically brake maintenance on this 2006 V6 Mustang. It needs both brake pads and rotors. So naturally we hit up our friends at Hawk Performance for their drilled and slotted Talon rotors and the Hawk HPS 5.0 pads. We'll show you quickly what to look for when you're looking at brake pads and specifically how much material is left, when they need to be replaced, and then show you a step-by-step installation and how to install these Talon rotors and HPS 5.0 pads on your V6 Mustang. Check it out. Today we're going to be focusing on brake maintenance. We have a 2006 Mustang V6 here that's in dire need of brakes, both pads and rotors. So we hit up our friends at Hawk Performance and they set us up with some Hawk Talon drilled and slotted rotors, perfect for the street, and Hawk HPS 5.0 pads. The Hawk lineup is offered for pretty much the entire gamut of Ford vehicles we offer here at Steeda.com. The Hawk Talon rotor is a great street performance rotor. If you're looking for a mild upgrade over the factory rotors, these are the way to go because they not only look the part, but they also perform well on the street and occasionally when they get hot on a back road or an autocross or anything like that. If you're looking for something a little bit more track oriented, we do have two-piece rotors available for many of the Mustang fitments. That is a two-piece design that's much lighter than stock, has those slotted vanes that not only look the part but perform properly out on track, and the cooling aspect as well. If you want to know anything more about the two-piece rotors we offer here at Steeda, check out the many videos we have on our YouTube channel and more information on our website. Now let's talk about brake pads. We have the HPS 5.0 pads from Hawk Performance here. We selected these specific pads for this application because this car will really only see the street and maybe an occasional autocross or back road. So it's the perfect, we'll call it a street performance upgrade over a stock pad. They're low noise and low dust and a great all-around brake pad for street applications. If you want to see Hawk Performance's other brake pad offerings, whether it's street or track, we've done all the testing for you. We have two videos on our YouTube channel covering both the street pads and the track pads, and frankly, what kind of braking distances you can expect in those natural environments, whether it's the street or the track. We also have a full write-up on our website at Steeda.com. You can see the link in the description. Being that this is a maintenance item, we will show you first what to look for when inspecting your brakes on your Mustang or Ford, and ultimately an installation video on these Hawk Talon rotors and HPS 5.0 pads. Before we start the install, you want to inspect both the front and rear areas just to make sure there's nothing else that needs to be serviced. Go ahead and get your car on a set of jack and jack stands or a car lift and then pull your wheels off. Determining whether or not you need to service your brakes, there are a few things you're going to want to look for, so we'll go over those things for you. First, once you have the wheels off of the car, you can get a good look at the rotor. Run your finger along the surface of the rotor where the pad meets the rotor. You can feel a ridge at the end. Depending on how deep that ridge is, you'll know that rotors will likely need to be replaced. Additionally, the smoother the surface of the rotor, the better. The more used a rotor is, you're likely to have more indentations along the surface where the pad meets the rotor. In this instance, it looks like the rotors have worn actually relatively well. But in most cases, we recommend replacing the rotors anytime you're doing the brake pads, so that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, moving on to the brake pad material, this is where you're really going to want to pay attention. You can see the pad material on the brake pad is pretty much gone. Typically, you're going to want to start looking at replacing your pads when the material reaches about 4 millimeters. We're not really measuring here, this is just eyeballing it to see if these pads need to be replaced, and that answer is definitely yes, because you can see in the front here, there is not much pad material left and you're actually getting pretty close to the squealer, which is actually on this car located on the inside pad. You can see in between the backing plate and the rotor itself, that is the pad material, and frankly, there is not much there, so these definitely need to be replaced. You can always turn your rotors, that's an age-old trick that works great. But in most cases, we always recommend when you're getting those Hawk Performance brake pads, pick up a set of rotors to go along with them. In addition to the pads and rotors, you want to check your end links. End links top and bottom have boots on the rear, so you want to make sure that there's no leakage or anything like that around the boot. Everything's tight. Additionally, these S197s are famous for having issues with the bushing in the lower control arm. This is something we sell on Steeda.com if it does need to be replaced. But keep an eye out for cracking or any signs of wear and tear in that rubber bushing. We do have an entire video dedicated to replacing the control arms on your S197 Mustang, so if you're interested, check that out. You also want to check your brake lines, both the hard line and the soft line. Look for rust on the hard lines. Just make sure there's no leaks or anything like that. Check your ABS line. You can see there's a little bit of surface rust on the surface of the hard line for the brakes. But again, there's absolutely nothing to worry about in this case, just something to note and keep an eye on going forward. Look down at your tie rods, check your ball joints. In this particular case, there was a little leakage from the boot around the ball joint, so that will eventually need to be serviced. While you're in here, you also want to check your sway bar bushings. In this instance, you can clearly see a crack full through the bushing on the sway bar mount. This is a great opportunity to upgrade to a Steeda adjustable sway bar. Looking up, pull up the dust boot on your strut, make sure everything looks good, there's no leakage or anything like that. Moving on to the rear, you want to look at the same thing. These rotors, again, look pretty darn good, all things considered. The rear pads aren't as bad as the front, but again, these are things you're going to want to make sure you look at and pay attention to. Between the backing plate and the rotor surface, check out that pad material. There's a little bit more here, but again, why just replace the front? When you have everything apart, go ahead and do the rear as well. While you're in the rear, you want to make sure you look around and inspect everything else. First things first, check out the shock. Moving on, the bump stop. If you check out our lowering spring video for the S197 Mustang, these bump stops don't actually look nearly as bad as that 250,000 mile car where it was actually crashing the suspension up against the metal there. These bump stops aren't too bad, but something to keep an eye on going forward, especially with a car like this that's lowered on iBox sport lines. Check out the isolators, both top and bottom, for your rear lowering springs, your ABS sensor line, your parking brake line that goes through the lower control arm. All these lines need to be checked and make sure that nothing's leaking, broken, or frayed. Moving back to the sway bar end link, check the bushings, check the bolts, make sure everything's tight. You can see some minor cracking in the lower bushing for the end link there that may need to be serviced going forward. Again, a great opportunity to upgrade to a set of Steeda sway bars. You also want to check the axle seals on either side, make sure there's no leakage or anything like that. Now you're ready to move on to installation. Starting at the rear, quick tip is to put one of the lug nuts back on the rotor. That way it holds the rotor in place while you're servicing the caliper. First thing you want to do is loosen up the two bolts that hold the caliper bracket into place. Pull the entire caliper assembly off and set it aside. That way now you can get your rotor off the car. It may be a little stubborn depending on how long the rotor's been installed in the car, but grab a rubber mallet, bang around the surface of the rotor along with the hub, and that way you can get the rotor free. Some PB Blaster may be helpful if your rotor's being unusually difficult. Now you can put the caliper bracket back in place so it's a little bit easier to service the caliper. Pull the caliper off and remove the old brake pads. Now you want to grab your brake caliper piston compression tool. You can find these basically at any automotive parts store, and even some of those automotive parts stores will rent the kit to you so you don't even have to buy it. Slowly compress the piston. It will push the piston in and turn it at the same time. Don't try to do this without the proper tool because you could damage the boot or the caliper. Depending on how worn down your brake pads are, that means there's more fluid in the system. If you have put more fluid in your system as your brake pads have worn down, that likely means that as you're compressing the piston, you may have the brake fluid overflow in the reservoir. So as you're compressing the piston, pop the cap off the reservoir under the hood and keep an eye just to make sure that your brake fluid doesn't overflow out of the reservoir. Now that the piston's been compressed, you can hang the caliper back up. Over time, surface rust can accumulate on these metal surfaces, so it's always a good idea to grab a Scotch-Brite pad or maybe some sandpaper and knock all the rust off. Then if you have some anti-seize, it's a great opportunity to add it on. And now you're ready to install your Hawk Talon rotor. Pay attention to the direction of the vanes on the rotor itself. You can see that this is the right rear rotor. Now that the rotor's been installed, you can reinstall your caliper bracket and caliper. It's always a good idea to add a little bit of blue Loctite onto the caliper bolts, that way they stay in place. Hawk Performance does include some lubricant in their brake pad boxes. Go ahead and use these on all the surfaces where the brake pads meet the caliper bracket and the piston itself, you can put them on the backing plate of the brake pad as well. Just make sure you don't put it on any of the surfaces where the brake pad meets the rotor. The purpose of this lubricant is to keep things quiet, especially in a floating caliper like this where the pads are moving back and forth. You can see the new Hawk HPS 5.0 pad and the old brake pad right next to each other. Barely any pad material left. This is an awesome opportunity to get brand new pads and rotors on your car and increase brake performance. Put additional lubricant on the back side of the brake pad, slide the pads into place. You can slide the caliper over top of the pads. You can see the springs on the back of the pad are supposed to go up against the caliper, and they provide tension to hold the pads in place. Go ahead and tighten the caliper down and tighten the caliper bracket, and you're good to move to the front. First, you want to remove the caliper from the spindle. There's a series of 2 bolts to remove the caliper and caliper bracket. Slide it off with the brake pads and hang it off to the side. Now you're ready to remove the rotor. Again, sometimes they can be stubborn, just take your time, you'll get it off. Now you can hang the caliper bracket back in place and you're ready to remove the caliper. Pop your old brake pads out. Compressing the brake pistons on the front are a lot easier. All you need is your old brake pad and a C-clamp. Position the brake pad over top of the pistons and the C-clamp on the back side of the caliper and start compressing. Again, make sure you keep an eye on the brake fluid reservoir under the hood, as you may have brake fluid overflowing from the top. Just keep an eye on it. Once the pistons are compressed, you can hang your caliper off to the side and put on your brand new Hawk Talon rotor. Again, pay attention to the vanes and the holes. This is the passenger side front. Now you're ready to grease up the surface where the brake pads will meet the caliper bracket. Throw some Loctite on those caliper bracket bolts and you can bolt the bracket back into place. You can slide the brake pad into place on the caliper bracket. Keep in mind that the springs do provide tension against the bracket to keep the pad away from the rotor surface when the brake's not being used. Do the same thing for the inside. Doesn't hurt to throw a little lubricant on the areas where the pad is going to be meeting the caliper. Slide the caliper on top of the brake pads and tighten the caliper down. Repeat the process on the other side and your installation's complete. And now that the Hawk Performance pads and rotors are installed on your Mustang, you're ready to bed your brakes. All right, the bedding procedure for these Hawk Performance HPS 5.0 pads, and frankly, any other Hawk street pad, is very simple. You do 6 to 10 stops from 30 to 35 miles an hour, and then 2 to 3 stops from 40 to 45 miles an hour. Then you let the car sit for 15 to 20 minutes, and you're good to go. So we're gonna show you that procedure and go from there. So what you want to do is get up to speed, get up to that 35, 40 miles an hour. You want to give it probably 80% pressure on the brake pedal, but you do not want any ABS engagement in order for these brakes to properly bed into the new rotors. So the key here is come down to about 5 miles an hour, let it roll out, and get back up to speed. Again, you don't want the pad to sit still on top of that rotor. All right, we'll loop it around, get a little bit faster, and do the same thing for 2 or 3 hard stops. 45, 50 miles an hour. Do a couple more. get them nice and hot, then let them sit. Hawk says 15 or 20 minutes, and out of convenience, that's great, but in an ideal situation, let it sit overnight. It's the best way to do it. All right, the hard part's done. And from there, you let the car sit 15 to 20 minutes per Hawk's recommendations. But again, we like to let the track pads sit overnight. Doesn't hurt to do the same for the street pads. Let them cool completely down. When it comes to pads and rotors, it really is a standard installation on this 06 V6 Mustang. Thanks to Hawk Performance, you're gonna get a street performance upgrade over the factory replacement stuff. We do recommend after you've bedded the brakes that you do let them completely cool down. One thing I do wanna note is that some smoke is normal during the bedding process. That's because the material from the pad is making its way onto the rotor, and sometimes some smoke does happen from that because these suckers are getting heated up for the first time. Aside from that, if you're looking for any Hawk Performance products, hit us up at Steeda.com. Comment below and let us know if you want to see any other maintenance videos, brake videos, S550, S197, you name it, right here on the Steeda YouTube channel. Hit that like and subscribe button, the notification bell, and don't forget the most important thing, speed matters.